Last week when we were with Jesus on that hillside in Galilee, he told us and his disciples that he wanted us to be salt and light in the world. What he meant by that is he wanted us to be good influence, to show our good works so people would recognize God. He wanted us to do that in spite of the persecution, opposition, and occupation that his disciples faced and the Jewish people faced in those times. And Matthew needs an opportunity to make a transition to the next phase of the Sermon on the Mount, so he has Jesus saying this: I have come not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And what we need to understand about the word fulfill is it's not like fulfilling a prophecy. To fulfill in the Greek means to make complete or to round out, and that's what Jesus has come to do. We also need to understand what law he was talking about. Jesus was memorializing the Mosaic law, the Ten Commandments, that overarching command to love God and to love neighbor. He wasn't talking about the 613 oral interpretations of the law. He wasn't talking about ritual piety or cleanliness. He wasn't talking about honoring the Sabbath. Because Jesus recognized that a lot of these things got in the way of God's command to love neighbor. And so whenever he had a chance, he set those aside. There were some rabbis in the ancient world that actually specified how many yards you could walk on the course of a Sabbath. Some even said that if your building or your house fell in on your family, that unless their lives were in imminent danger, you couldn't do anything but give them food and water. You weren't allowed to dig them out until Sabbath was over. Jesus spoke out against the not touching people who were in need or were sick, because he did it all the time when he healed. He was understood that the Sabbath was a gift from God for humanity. So whenever these ritual pietistic laws got in the way of people's care for one another, Jesus rejected them. He was memorializing the Ten Commandments and that overarching thing of love God and love neighbor, because these were gifts to the Jewish people. They saw them as gifts from God and instruction on how they were to live their lives in a way that was beneficial to each other and to their understanding and relationship of God. In fact, the word law is a really poor interpretation in our English. A better word is instruction. So Jesus is memorialized and showing how important the Mosaic law is and kind of shed off all these outer pietistic traditions. And then he starts to give us some examples in these 6 antitheses that come next. And the first one says, you have heard it said, but I tell you. What Jesus is saying is that you have heard from the Old Testament, from Torah and the prophets, what it is we're expected to do. But he goes, now I'm telling you, I'm rounding this out, I'm giving you more to think about. And he says, you have heard it said that you shall not commit murder. But I tell you, anybody that has anger in their heart toward their brother or sister is already liable for their murders. Jesus is concerned about what's in our hearts and what's in our heads, because from those places emanate the actions that we take. Jesus talks a lot about anger, and this anger, there are 2 Greek words for anger. One is like a straw fire that you light it and whoosh, and it's over in a heartbeat. And we have a lot of angers like that. When somebody pulls in front of us, or with the roundabout on the edge of town, when people don't know how to do them, we have that momentary anger that just whooshes and it's over. But what Jesus is talking about is a different kind of anger. The word in the Greek has to do with a smoldering fire. It's something that gets inside us and it consumes us and it takes us over. And rather than dealing with that anger, we'd rather fan that flame. We'd rather that anger grow and build. And when we allow that anger to happen, it ends up with us acting out in ways that are harmful to other people, including murder. I did a little research on the statistics of homicides recently in our country, and in 2019 we had 19,414 homicides. In 2020 we had 21,050, and already in 2021 we're running 30% higher than we were before. And by Wednesday of this past week there had already been 5 school shootings. 5. And if you saw any of the film of the last one at Arlington, Texas High School, You saw what happened, and I'm not trying to okay what this young man did, but he had been bullied, he had been treated by racists in a way that wasn't good. And finally that anger that generates from fear got the best of him, and he decided to pull a gun to protect himself because he was afraid of where things were going. In fact, so much of fear has to do, or anger comes from fear. It's that fear that we're not going to be heard, that we're not going to be accepted, that people won't like us, that if somebody gets something they deserve, that means less for us. And this fear leads to anger, and this anger ultimately leads to violence and can ultimately lead to death, to murder, and to homicide. So Jesus gives us two examples of what it means to deal with the anger before it gets to that point. The first one is about if you go to the temple to offer a sacrifice, and while you're there you remember that a brother or sister has something against you, that you're to go and reconcile that difference to them so that you can then come back and make your offering. Now it's important to understand here that Jesus was saying this while in Galilee, and he was speaking in hyperbole to make the point, because if somebody had traveled from Galilee to Jerusalem to sacrifice, that was a 3-day journey. And while they were there, they would have probably had to buy a sacrifice at an exorbitant price, take it up to the altar, and then Jesus says if you get there, before you hand that animal over to the priest, if you realize or remember that there's a brother or sister that you have a quarrel with, you're to travel 3 days back to Galilee, find that person, resolve that issue, and travel 3 more days back to finish your sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. Obviously this is impractical, but this hyperbole that Jesus is using tells us just how important it is for us to resolve the issues that we have between us and other people. The second example was a little bit more of his day. He said if you're on your way to court with your witnesses and your accuser with their witnesses and your families, and you're going to the village, which is where court took place, the village gate, where the elders would judge on your case, he goes, if you're on your way there and you realize that you can solve this before you get there, that you need to do everything you can to resolve this conflict with this person that's accusing you, because if they win, you'll be handed over to the guard who will hand you over to prison, and you will have to be there until you've paid every last penny of what's owed. Can you imagine being in jail and not being able to raise money to pay the debt you owe? Can you imagine that while you're in prison, your family and your wife are struggling because there's no income coming in? Your wife and daughters might have to resort to prostitution to make money, or become beggars at the temple in order to make ends meet. Jesus is giving us these two examples to make the point that reconciliation is everything. Finding a way to put back together the divisions that are between us, to fix broken relationships, and the ability to do that starts right here in each of our own hearts and heads. And when we learn to reconcile, to forgive, to ask for forgiveness with the people sitting next to us in the pew, and then with our extended families, and with our co-workers, our community, and ultimately our world, we bring shalom to everybody. Can you imagine living in a world where reconciliation is better path than anger, where everybody is more concerned about not being right, but about being reconciled to that person sitting next to them? Can you imagine in the political divide that we have today, if our lawmakers could join together, cross lines, and do good things for us instead of complaining about each other? Can you imagine what it would be like if we were to step up against racism, if we were to step up against genderism and social injustices? Imagine a world where reconciliation is the #1 goal. And that's the lesson from the Sermon on the Mount for today.